For me, one of the biggest lessons of FIFA and the IOC is that you can love problematic things. And that you can say, I love this about this, and I will continue at the top of my voice to say this is still a problem. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are very welcome to our final week of coverage of the country of Brazil during our deep dive in Book 2 of the Colonizer's World Tour. We've been in Brazil this whole month, and we've learned so much. I would say that what I have learned most is that I have so much more to learn.
Yeah.
This week is probably, I'll be honest, my entry into Brazil. And why I was interested in talking about it in the first place. So we are talking this week about the World Cup and the Olympics and COVID, three of the things that dominated their story of the 2010s outside of Dilma Rousseff's impeachment trial, which we covered in the first week of this time. But if you know about Brazil, you probably know they're good at football. You may remember that they just hosted an Olympics if you don't know about the World Cup. And you may know some things about what their president thinks about COVID. So we wanted to have those conversations this week. Dr. Erin, before we leap in, what did you know? What are you bringing in?
Yes, I had heard of Pelé. I knew about their football prowess. I knew much less about football than you, so I'm super excited to have our conversation about the film we chose for this week, which is in fact a documentary about Pelé. Because you knew a lot and I didn't know anything. And so I was watching it like fresh, which was fun. I'm normally not surprised by those kinds of things. I didn't see a lot of the stories around 2014 World Cup and 2016 in Rio because I was still in Belfast. And so like I watched the World Cup, but was I aware of what was happening culturally? Not so much. Same with Rio. 2016 was a hell of a year for things happening, especially that summer. And then, a lot that I learned from last year, especially about COVID, because we were in the middle of COVID as we still are. And there was a lot about what Bolsonaro has to say and to not say about the COVID. How about yourself?
I mean, summary, I knew that FIFA and the IOC are both corrupt as hell and that Bolsonaro thinks that COVID was fake.
I didn't know how corrupt the FIFA was. I did not know.
I'm just so excited to have you with me on this journey.
Lord have mercy, y'all.
So I grew up in a football family, in a sports family, just like Dr. Erin did, but she grew up in a winter sports family, and I grew up in a summer sports family. So, I mean, God, like, I know Brazil. I owned a Brazil football top at one point. Like,
sure.
I know that yellow... the incredible symbol of the yellow jersey.
Yellow with the green, yeah.
Yellow with the green and the blue.
Yeah.
I watched all of the World Cup. One of my favorite 2014 World Cup memories is actually all of us sitting in the Belfast Empire chanting, I believe that we will win, when the U.S. was actually in the top 16, which was...
I remember
and
that.
Tim Howard, somebody changed his Wikipedia profile to Secretary of Defense instead of goalkeeper for the men's national team.
That was 2015?
That was 2014. That was the 2014 World Cup. Yep.
Yeah, and especially because, like, we had the World Cup and Euros. I felt like it was always one or the other. I remember...
Yeah, and then in 2015, we had the Women's World Cup, where you and me and my brother stayed up until, like, 2 a.m. to watch the women win.
Yes, we did.
Yeah,
and we went to watch them someplace like with my mom when she visited. Like, I have all these memories of watching football in Belfast, and I loved it.
But you don't like remember when they are?
I don't know which like tournament is which. Okay. I remember like going to the Arrow and watching matches. I remember watching them in the Students' Union. I remember watching them in the kitchen in 42. But, like, I'm like, which tournament is which? It's just a lot of football.
So the I believe that we will win chanting was the 2014 World Cup.
Amazing.
And I believe that we also took your mom with us to watch it at the Student Union, at the Speakeasy Pub in the Student Union, because that was one of the times your mom visited.
Yeah.
I'm also, at that time in our particular lives, had more nerddom bandwidth than you did. So I was very aware of all of the conversations around it. I had been watching news reports, and I listened, even back then, I listened to the Men in Blazers podcast, which is still my favorite football podcast. And they were talking a lot about the concerns that people had about the corruption in Brazil and the amount of money that was being spent in 2014. And then in 2015, when the big FIFA scandals broke, I learned a lot more about how bad FIFA was. 2016, I was done my PhD. I was living back in America. You were still working on yours. And so I was actually in the same time zone as Rio, and it was very easy to watch. And I remember all of the stories around it and watched all those news reports. I also remember the Ryan Lochte story that he made up getting mugged and everything else. That was that summer.
I remember that.
And then we all lived through COVID together, and I'm, not among Bolsonaro's biggest fans.
Not
so
much.
I knew all of that. And now, in terms of what I didn't know, is I didn't really know why Brazil was a football powerhouse. And so for my particular journey into this, I wanted to answer that question. So what I did was buy this book, The Football Nation, A Footballing History of Brazil by David Goldblatt, and read it to understand why exactly Brazil is so synonymous with football. And that is what I am going to, because then once we understand why they're synonymous with football, we're going to understand some other things. So I'm going to open up this conversation with that and explaining that. TLDR, it's a cheap sport to learn how to play. And you can play it anywhere. And you can play it in any formation. By the time we really get colonization fading in Brazil, you still have Europeans coming over. And one of the things that Europeans brought when they first came was football. British folks brought football. And other British expats were looking for other British expats to hang out with. And so they started forming football clubs. And pretty soon, other people wanted to play because it's really fun to play. It's simple, it's easy, et cetera, et cetera. They talk a lot in the book. David Goldblatt talks a little bit in the book about it was probably not until like the first World Cup was broadcast. And at that point, football had been in Brazil for 50 years. It probably wasn't until the first World Cup was broadcast in radios that anyone knew the official rules of football. Everybody just knew how to play it.
Yeah.
And so that kind of kept happening. It also intersects with all of the other kind of pieces of Brazilian culture. There's massive corruption. There's massive racism. There's a huge class warfare issue here where the university students and the elites tried to keep football and the working class and the businessmen took it back from them. And there's lots of mythos around this. And then football was becoming synonymous with, with Brazil. And then what happened was this really interesting time period between the old republic, which is kind of what they called the first government after independence, and the dictatorship in 1965. When did that thing take over? 1965? 64. Thank you.
Yeah, the Estado Novo was the new state that was in between those two. Yeah.
So during the Estado Novo is when you get a lot of money into the arts and a lot of money into poetry and everything else. And what was everyone's favorite muse? Football. And this is where you get the mythos of the beautiful game. Because what Brazil did, and that's actually where we get the phrase, is if you've ever heard football referred to as the beautiful game, we got that from Brazil.
Huh.
And one of the reasons that we got that is that they took the very angular style of football that the Brits were doing, and they added Brazilian body movement to it. They added the artistry. They added the everything kind of else. And Goldblatt doesn't cover this. My theory as to why it landed differently and those body rhythms, which you can argue the Argentinians have and the Uruguayans have and the Paraguayans have. The reason it landed differently in Brazil was Brazil's relationship with colonization that we've talked about, where they went through this like gentle decolonization in a weird way.
Yeah.
and kind of how many white people showed up at different times and all this kind of other stuff. But anyway, so that's why we have the beautiful game. Is that phrase, that idea is the Brazilians. So it just kind of kept happening. And it just kept getting cemented. There's some theories and some discussion that if they had not won the 1970 World Cup, and you do not have that iconic picture of in the bright Mexican sun, the 1970 World Cup, I should say, the very first one broadcast worldwide in color. So you don't have this romantic picture of Pele winning in the beautiful yellow thing in the gorgeous Mexican sun, that some of it may have fizzled. But what Brazil needed during the junta, during the dictatorship, was to remember who they were. And that period, that mental image is what drove them. Now, fast forward, we're out of the dictatorship, we're out of everything, and we have now entered capitalism into the global game of football in such a enthusiastic way.
Whoo, boy, did they ever.
I want to fast forward to 2007. We're skipping a whole lot, but I think this is a really key. We're not doing the history of Brazil. We're doing the World Cup. And what I want to explain, the World Cup and the Olympics. In 2007, Brazil hosted the Pan American Games. I don't know what they are either. It doesn't matter. They're a big sporting event. 2007 is also, at this point, they had been awarded the World Cup by Sepp Blatter, who sounds like a Bond villain because he is. I want to quote from the book from the football in yeah. Ahem. The 2007 Pan American Games became the template for the way in which Brazil planned for, built, and staged mega events. The country could put on a slick spectacular for a privileged local audience and the TV cameras in fortified enclaves, secured by a mixture of flagrant media boosterism and harshly authoritarian political and policing practice. Financially, the show rested on a huge transfer of resources and land from the public to the private sector that nobody had the power to protest. There was no meaningful democratic consultation or planning, helping ensure that money was lost, embezzled, or wasted, and there was never any thought given to post-games planning and legacies. None of this gave FIFA or the IOC pause for thought as they handed the hosting rights to the World Cup and the Olympics, respectively. There you go.
That's it in a nutshell.
That's it. So in terms of where we kind of go from there, the key issues are those connections, the insane corruption, not only of FIFA and the IOC, but let's call it out, the Brazilian government. I jokingly emailed Aaron the other day, but I actually think it's true. I have yet to find a single benefit, like long-term benefit, for Rio hosting the Olympics, except that they got a semi-functional transportation system. So I can't find a single one for the World Cup at all. There was every single country that hosts the World Cup or the Olympics since the 70s at least, what it has done is exacerbate inequity. It has exacerbated debt. It has exacerbated problems. London got out of this a little bit better than anyone else because they actually planned for what they were going to do with everything afterwards. And on the whole, they've done that. So it's been pretty good. Also, it's a lot easier to get people to come to London than it is to Rio. I'm just going to say it. So, and the inequity that was there to begin with is narrower than the inequity in Rio to begin with. So, all that to say, if you are watching this and you're like, I don't think that FIFA and the IOC are very corrupt, what I would love to invite you to do is, in our show notes, there are 2 videos from John Oliver about FIFA. We would love to have you watch those. He will explain everything as to why hosting the World Cup is conflicted for those of us that enjoy watching it. And there's lots and lots and lots of stuff on the internet these days about the IOC and especially their decisions to, like, around the Chinese Winter Games, for instance, have fun, do some Googling. I didn't get to that, and we focused on some other things, but there's lots and lots of evidence of IOC's corruption. You won't have any trouble finding it.
Yeah.
So what this all means is that in 2014, we have this massive thing that they spent a ton of money on that they made no money on. We're in the middle of it. We hit a recession. 2016, we're about to host the Rio Olympics. We're in the middle of an impeachment trial for our president. We still haven't made any money on the World Cup. We're shelling out more money for the Olympics. So we hit the election of Bolsonaro. The country has no money. It has no infrastructure, and then COVID hits. So that's why we wanted to have this conversation today.
I mean, there's seminal events in recent Brazilian history for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only other thing that I will say is that I think for me, one of the examples of why that they came out worse than a lot of other places in recent memory. Like the Beijing Olympics were the most expensive Olympics in recent memory. But like China's China. And they figured out how to rebound. Brazil had a whole lot of things going against it, including 2 of these events in 2 years. Like,
it's just insane.
Insane. Like the American economy couldn't, I don't think. But then also the way that that FIFA and the organizers of the Brazil World Cup chose to execute the World Cup, weird. They decided to make it an entire country affair, which now is starting to happen more and more. So like the last, the next World Cup, I can't remember, but it's like 2 or 3 countries, and it's going to be in a bunch of different places because now we're trying to realize that you have to reuse existing things instead of building new stuff. And I think if we look back in the history of the World Cup and the Olympics, we will see Brazil as the example of why you have to do that. Because what Brazil did was pick all of these towns that needed tourists, but didn't have the infrastructure to get them there, didn't actually have the football team to use the facility afterwards, didn't have any of those things. They built brand new facilities. So then you heard a lot of this during the World Cup is that the play was terrible because teams were exhausted. They were flying the equivalent of Orlando to Oregon and back in a day to play a world-class game in like 100-degree temperatures. All the great World Cup teams are Northern European. We just don't play in that kind of heat, my man. So there was a lot of those kind of things. But then also in 2016 for the Olympics, that's where capitalism really comes in. There's a very iconic stadium in Brazil called the Maracanã. And if you remember anything about either the World Cup or the Olympics, you've probably heard someone talk about the Maracanã Stadium. Well, they refitted it completely so that the elite of the elite of the elite wouldn't actually ever have to interact with someone who wasn't in their social class. They did so many renovations to it that the stadium has not been used since. It has fallen almost derelict, and vandals have stolen tens of thousands of chairs from it. Brazil has made no money on either one of those events. And also, from what I'm reading, they were really hoping that the 2014 World Cup would be like a real coming out party for Football Nation. Lula kind of said it a lot, that Football Nation would get behind, and we would become Brazil again. They hadn't been winning a whole lot. They didn't really have a big popular Pele style person. And instead, the Brazilian people protested. They said, we don't want this. We don't have the money for this. Also, we don't make any money off of this because FIFA takes all the money. Also, the IOC takes about 50% of what countries pay for make in the Olympics. FIFA takes almost it all. So the Brazilian people did not re-support Football Nation. And then you have like all the other stuff. So some of the analysts that I was reading is that this completely backfired in the point that Brazil is actually internally no longer synonymous with its national team. It's no longer internally. I mean, not internationally, we all think of Brazil football, but internally they don't cling to the football identity as they once did. And that somewhat is because of the corruption around 14-16. And then now the COVID. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if they have a showing in Qatar this summer. How the team, because the other thing is too, they lost their own home. They lost their home World Cup. They lost 7-1. In one of their games, which is unheard of. So it'll be interesting to see what showing they have in the Qatar World Cup. And please don't make me talk about that too much, but I know we're going to. So that's everything I've got to say. What I'd love now as the non-football nerd, I'd love to know what you want to bring up now.
Yeah, so it's not shocking anyone. I didn't really focus a lot on the football of it because I knew that was going to be Dr. Kristen's bag. In terms
It's
of...
okay, guys. When we do Russia, she's going to talk about hockey, and I'm just going to sit here and look pretty. So it's all going to be good. Don't worry.
I don't have anything more to add, I don't think, on football, except in terms of, some of the intersections that we always examine with these 101s in terms of folks with disabilities, right? Economic disaster is never good for folks with disabilities. I read some things and watched some things about the negative impact of the World Cup and the Olympics, especially in terms of the crackdown in policing in favelas ahead of the sports events, the way that people were displaced, the lack of access, the lack of money that goes into access for people with disabilities. So all of that impacted folks with disabilities disproportionately, as it always does. COVID was not great for them, again, because of access issues, because the poorest, most disabled people tend to live in places that don't have the resources for COVID, for testing, for access to medical care, and all of that. So, there's some interesting articles that we've shared about what the Paralympics looked like in Brazil and how Paralympic athletes felt. There's a fantastic 7-minute video on blind soccer in Brazil, and the history of blind soccer in Brazil, which was really cool to watch. So there was some good ones in there. In terms of Indigenous folks, it's a lot of displacement when it comes to these events, right? Because where they're building these new stadiums, or where they're making these centers, especially for the World Cup and for the Olympics, a lot of times was encroaching on Indigenous land. There was the Indigenous community that was forced to move. They had set up a museum outside the Maracanã Stadium in 2013. And they were forced to move as a part of the renovations, and they had been there for quite some time. So we've got articles on that. One thing that I learned about sports and Indigenous folks was that the first ever World Indigenous Games happened in Brazil 9 months before the Olympics. And it's called the Indigenous Olympics, and they've continued since then, the World Indigenous Games. And Dilma Rousseff was booed when she showed up to the opening ceremonies because of the perception of her in terms of the Petrobras scandal, but also the shit show that was the World Cup and the Olympics and all of this that came together. In terms of COVID and Indigenous communities, one of the biggest concerns for Indigenous communities is the loss of elders. And I read this fascinating article about Indigenous youth talking about the impact of COVID on their communities. And there's a quote that they said, that one of the youth said, that our elders are our books. Because of the history of oral traditions and storytelling in a lot of Indigenous cultures. There's a huge loss of knowledge. And this is something I've seen in the United States in Indigenous communities. I know lots of elders have been lost in Indian country, and so people that I follow and on Twitter have talked about the loss of elders and the impact of that, which I thought was an interesting dynamic, that we don't necessarily have the same kind of understanding and relationship with communal elders. Obviously, they've suffered from a huge lack of public health information in Indigenous languages, poor internet connection, the only information being available in Portuguese, and they don't speak Portuguese. There's also a real problem with misinformation, specifically in Brazil, from religious leaders and politicians about COVID. And because they can't access public health information, the only information they're getting is from WhatsApps sent out by pastors. So it's been real hard to tackle that, especially when you combine it with an innate and justified lack of trust in the government. When the government has only ever tried to suppress you and take your land, they're handing out leaflets on COVID, you're gonna be nope. So it's made it really, really difficult, specifically for COVID and Indigenous communities. But for me, looking at the human rights issues, all three of these events and happenings bring about a lot of human rights issues. And you the misuse of public funds and the displacement of people. There were lots of protests before the World Cup that I didn't even realize. And the call of the protest was that they wanted FIFA quality hospitals and FIFA quality transportation, which I loved.
Yep.
And just the blanket assumption that because it was football, everyone would get behind it.
Yeah, there's one, and I couldn't find the video itself, but I read a video described where like Lula is somewhere, and he was very famously a huge Corinthians supporter, which is one of their internal clubs. And he was saying like, it's amazing, we're gonna have this big party. and someone screamed back, we can't play football on broken roads.
Yeah. So, it's an interesting dynamic, and I learned in watching the Pele documentary that when Brazil hosted the World Cup, they hosted it in 1950 and then they hosted it in 2014. In both times, it was seen as this like coming out party for the nation, as like we're stepping onto the global stage. And in 2014, it was more like in relationship to being named one of the BRIC countries, but then having an economic crisis after the global recession and like all of these dynamics. But it's so interesting to see the way that the public engaged with that very political narrative.
Yep.
In terms of that, the World Cup cost a lot of money. I want to read and a lot of lives, some stats. So $4 billion was spent on new or renovated stadiums. 80% of that was public money. Again, most of that money went to FIFA, which is a nonprofit. Please watch the John Oliver doc clips down below. Boy, it's bad. 250,000 people were displaced or forcibly evicted because of the World Cup. There were over 1 million protesters on the streets and over 200,000 police deployed. The scale of the societal unrest. So when people say sports aren't political or sports aren't important, like, come on, folks. Especially in Brazil. Human rights issues in Brazil because of COVID, not great. Bolsonaro didn't and doesn't believe in COVID, said a lot of similar things to President Trump here in terms of spreading misinformation about the nature of the virus. The health minister for the Brazilian government talked about it very seriously early on and urged people to stay home, and he was removed from his position by Bolsonaro. As of last October, they had the second highest death toll in the world, behind the United States with 600,000 people. It has ravaged Brazil and continues to do so, especially since they pulled out of a lot of restrictions and limitations before a lot of other places, but it's also exceptionally hard to enforce given the lack of infrastructure and equity. It's just real hard. And so we've got a couple videos on what communities did and favelas did because the favelas aren't run by the government. They aren't enforced. There's no like government policing at all in favelas. And so they're left to their own devices. And in a global pandemic, that's like
we've been saying forever, explain to me how social distancing happens in poverty.
Right. Like you can't. And so if you want to see what that looked like, we've got some really good videos for kind of visualizing. I think it's really important to understand what favelas look like as you're learning about them and what it's like to walk around in them. We've had videos over this last month with people in wheelchairs and what it's like to try and live in a favela while living in a wheelchair, and living in a favela during a global pandemic, just disastrous. So then disproportionately, all of the marginalized groups that end up in favelas because of the systems of colonization in Brazil are the ones disproportionately affected by the COVID. So I'm going to try and end this on a positive note in that I hope that the unmitigated disaster of these sporting events in Brazil, I'm not going to talk about COVID because COVID's like specific and universal everywhere. But hopefully the disaster of these events means that we start to rethink how they're run and how we do them. I think we're starting to have different conversations about it. You know, they reused a lot of places in the most recent Winter Olympics. Like, I hope we can have a global conversation about it. I don't feel so great about the World Cup because it's happening in Qatar and like 4,000 people have died building stadiums and it's going to be 125 degrees playing soccer, which just sounds like football players are going to die. So FIFA is another thing, but hopefully we can start to think about a different way to have the Olympics. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, one of the biggest lessons of FIFA and the IOC is that you can love problematic things. And that you can say, I love this about this, and I will continue at the top of my voice to say this is still a problem. Mm-hmm. I know that I'm going to be watching the World Cup this summer, for sure. I'm just going to say, it's the World Cup. I'm absolutely going to be watching it. But if there is any single opportunity I have to call out the corruption within FIFA, that a country where it's 120 degrees in the summer was awarded a outdoor sporting event. Like John Oliver says in the thing, I hope it's corruption, because if not, somebody's actually dumb. Like,
it has to be. It has
every
to be.
Opportunity I have to do that, I will certainly call it out.
Yeah.
So yes, my other thing is in a certain way it's positive for us because it's dunking on English football fans, which is one of our favorite things to do.
Always fun.
So something I learned in Football Nation is that there was, so I should say, if you don't know this, one of the reasons that beer is not sold in Brazil during sporting events is that it has one of the most deadly sporting event body counts of any country. Brazil is a very violent society that extends to football fans. They stopped selling alcohol in like the 80s because of that. There's also a lot of other laws, which FIFA broke, but I digress.
Or like rewrote. Ugh.
But there wasn't any violence in the fans in the stands of Brazilian football until 1966, when they watched the World Cup on television and saw how the English fans were behaving and decided to copy them.
I mean, the Brits.
Givers all the time.
All the time, yeah.
So thus concludes our 101s for Brazil, which we could do. I mean, like, honestly, we could talk about Brazil for the rest of time and barely scratch the surface.
Yeah.
But we are going to hit pause here on the 101s. We do have one more video.
Wait. I have to do my fact.
Oh, you didn't do it yet. Oh, no, you're right. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I have to do my Jeopardy fact because it's actually hilarious.
Okay.
Half of it's hilarious. So there's an inquiry currently ongoing into Bolsonaro's handling of COVID. He's been charged with crimes against humanity, not the hilarious part, and charlatanism, which
By who?
By the government. By the Senate. I did not know charlatanism was still a thing that you could be charged with. But I thought that was entertaining, and that was my COVID tidbit. I was like, oh yeah, crimes against humanity, and it was like listing it out. It was like charlatanism. I was like, what?
This is like, I'm going to learn what charlatanism the same way I had to learn what wire fraud really meant during Nexium. I didn't know what that was. Now we have to. Yes. Okay.
Now we have
I love
to
it.
learn what
Charlatanism actually is.
And
oh my gosh.
How you get charged with it, but it's one of the charges potentially against Jair Bolsonaro.
Because I have a feeling that Elizabeth Holmes should have been charged with it.
Right?
If we're, you know.
Is this a thing? Is this a Brazilian thing? Is this like is this a Spanish Inquisition thing that you can be charged as being a charlatan? Because I'm not sure we have charlatanism as a crime in the United States. But I'm gonna.
If I'm honest, if we have it as a crime and it hasn't been being used, like you want to say the courts are backed up now. Let's.
I know. It tickled me, and now I have another rabbit hole to fall down, which is the history of charlatanism as a criminal charge.
I love it. All right, so now here's the real ending. We're going to be back with you tomorrow to talk about Pele, the documentary. Dr. Erin's going to tell you everything she learned about football. And we are going to be so excited to join with you then. What we hope for you today, if this is where you're ending your Brazil coverage with us because you don't care about Pele, which is totally valid, our hope for you is that wherever you are from and in whatever you are doing, that you are finding things that bring you joy that don't also harm other people. And that you can find hope and happiness and love in whatever circumstances, bloom wherever you're planted, as some of the terrible inspirational stickers say, but that truly you could experience that. We have deeply enjoyed our time focusing on Brazil, our traditional call. If you yourself are Brazilian, Brazilian American, Brazilian something else hyphen, and you would like to come and share your life experience or your perspective on these topics, our channel is at your disposal and we'd love to talk to you. And if you liked the video, do the YouTubey things. That thumbs up means that more people see it and more people can join the conversation. And maybe more people know about how terrible FIFA is, which is one of my new life goals, to just be the evangelist for how evil FIFA is.
So many soapboxes. We have so many soapboxes.
Subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss a single video, because the Colonizer World Tour rolls on. After we finish here, we're over to the African continent again to talk about a couple countries over there. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. And we'll see you tomorrow for Pele.
Bye.